Suppressing false ideas does not strengthen truth, it actually weakens truth. Because if truth never faces challenge, if what you believe to be true is never subjected to public contestation, then it becomes lazy. Your ideas go unexamined, they become dogmas rather than true beliefs. And it's really worth thinking about that in relation to the misinformation crusade that you have in this country. Anthony Albanese, I can't even bear to listen to his voice, but whenever I see him, he seems to be going on about misinformation. We have the same thing in the United Kingdom and across Europe. They're obsessed with misinformation, and our governments are spreading one of the falsest ideas of modern times, which is that truth is a fragile beast that needs to be protected from public contestation. That they know the truth and they need to ring fence it from the supposed misinformation of plebs, ordinary people, or even people in this room. That is the opposite of what's true.
I want to tell the story of freedom of speech as I understand it. Freedom of speech not as a law,
not as a slogan, but as an idea. And an idea that did not appear fully formed. This was an idea that grew slowly, painfully, and sometimes dangerously over centuries and centuries of struggle. And it's always worth bearing that in mind. It's always worth bearing in mind that when we say we support free speech, it's worth asking ourselves, what does that actually mean? Where does this idea come from? Who gifted it to us and what were their intentions? It's an easy thing to say, and pretty much everyone says, I support free speech, even the people who don't. But what does it mean? How was it built? How did it develop? It's really worth knowing that history. So I'm going to give you my history of freedom of speech. I'm sure someone else could give you a different potted history. And strangely enough, in my view, the story of freedom of speech can be told through four men, all of whom were called John. The four Johns, as we might refer to them, which is a bit of an awkward phrase because John in American slang means toilet. So if you say the four Johns, people think you're talking about four toilets, but I'm not. I'm talking about four men, four great men, all called John, who are pretty much the reason all of us are able to have open conversations like the one we're going to have today. The four Johns are John Lilburn, John Milton, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill. Each of them lived in very different moments in history. Each of them fought quite different battles against the state, against overbearing power. And each of them pushed the idea of liberty forward, step by step, from freedom of conscience to freedom of thought to freedom of speech itself. And that's how I always understand the building blocks of the liberty to utter, as John Milton called it. It starts with the revolutionary idea that people should have the right to abide by their own conscience. It develops into the equally revolutionary idea that we should be free to think and pray and believe as we see fit. And it ends with the super revolutionary idea that, you know what, we should also be free to say what we think as well, to give voice in the public realm to all those thoughts swirling around in our consciences and our minds. So let's begin where liberty began for many Europeans, with conscience. And in my Anglo-centric take, that means starting with a gentleman called John Lilburn. If you're not familiar with John Lilburn, I suggest you go home tonight and Google him. John Lilburn is hands down my favourite activist from British history. He was also known as Freeborn John. He was born around 1614 during a time when England, as many of you will know, was tearing itself apart over religion, over politics, over power. The King and the Church of England were demanding religious conformity. And to disagree with them was not only unpopular, it was not only unfashionable, it was dangerous. John Lilburn was not a philosopher. He was not writing elegant treatises in some candlelit library. He was a fighter. He was a pamphleteer. He was a contrarian. Someone once said of him that if he was alone in a room, John would have an argument with Lilburn. He was that contrarian. So when people call me a contrarian, I take it as a great badge of honor because I think of people like him. And he was a man who was arrested more times than he could count for the crime of obeying the diktats of his conscience. His story begins really around 1637, and that's the year when he was arrested for distributing Puritan religious pamphlets. There may be some Puritans in this room, or Puritan-inspired people. Pamphlets that criticised the Church of England. And these pamphlets would be spirited into England from the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic at the time was really the first nation founded in Enlightenment ideals, and it was much freer there to print dissenting pamphlets, which would then be smuggled into England. And John Lilburn would distribute these radical pamphlets among ordinary people in taverns, over a pint of ale, in secret meeting rooms, on dark street corners. He would hand out these revolutionary pamphlets that criticised the religious authorities and the royal authorities. For doing that, he was dragged before the infamous Star Chamber, which I guess was their version of kind of a hate speech court. It was the court in which the authorities crushed political and religious dissent. And the Star Chamber demanded that John Lilburn take an oath that would require him to answer any question that the court asked, even if it incriminated him. And Lilburn refused. And it was really important that he refused to do that, because he said something that was incredibly radical at that time. He said that no man should be forced to accuse himself, and no authority should have power over another person's inner conscience. Now, to us, that sounds normal, right? How dare the authorities invade our conscience and right into our very souls and tell us what to think or what to believe? But it was a radical idea in the 1630s in England. For refusing to do that, he was whipped through the streets of London. He was tied to the back of a cart. He was publicly beaten, and he was thrown into jail. And the eyewitness accounts of his public torture really are something to behold. It's worth reading them. We're told by one contemporary historian that John Lilburn was tied to the back of a cart on a hot summer's day and unremittingly whipped as he walked with a bare back all the way from the end of Fleet Street to Westminster Palace Yard. I walked that route many times myself. It's quite a long route, especially on a hot day when you're being whipped on your bare back. I've never done that, just to be clear. One bystander guessed that Lilburn had received 500 blows from the whip, and a contemporary historian says his shoulders swelled as big as a penny loaf from the bruises he received. Most strikingly, Lilburn would not shut up. He would not stop spreading his ideas. So when he arrived at the pillory in Westminster to be tied up and mocked, in spite of his wounds and the burning sunshine, he loudly told his story to the assembled crowd, and he reiterated his criticisms of the bishops. So even as he was being publicly tortured, he carried on saying what he believed to be true about the church. A lawyer told him to shut up, to stop talking, but he wouldn't. So they gagged him. They covered his mouth. And they covered his mouth so roughly that blood spurted from inside. So he couldn't speak anymore, but he carried on. He used his hands to pull pamphlets from his pockets and threw them into the crowd. So then they tied his hands behind his back so that he wouldn't be able to do that either. And all that he had left, all that he could do was stamp his feet. He couldn't talk. His hands were tied. He couldn't distribute his pamphlets. So he stood there stamping his feet in defiance of the authorities. And I often think about that. How many of us would do that for what we believe to be true these days? So, for example, one of my deeply held beliefs, and I'm sure many of you share this, is that a man cannot become a woman. Very strange thing to have to say in 2026, but one has to say it. I deeply believe that. Would I allow myself to be publicly humiliated for that belief? Would I allow myself to be whipped, gagged, put in jail? I'm not sure that I would. So when we think about our freedom to speak, it's worth thinking about what other earlier generations went through in order that we would have that liberty. And from prison, Lilburn kept writing. He insisted that Englishmen possessed what he called free-born rights. Rights that did not come from kings or parliaments, but from the act of birth itself. When you are born, you are free. It was a revolutionary idea. And he argued that every man's conscience must look to itself alone. You should never be compelled by an external authority to change your conscience, to change what you believe to be true. And think about what Lilburn was defending. He was not yet defending freedom of speech as we know it today. He was defending something deeper, something a bit more fragile, the right to believe, the right to hold convictions, the right to answer to one's conscience before answering to any government. He helped to plant the first seed for what we today call freedom of speech. He insisted that authority should have no control over the soul. And that really is the starting point of the story of freedom that we're hopefully going to discuss today. But defending conscience raised a new question. If people are free to believe, must they also be free to think and to share those thoughts with others? And that question was really taken up with vigour by the next John in our story, John Milton. Let's talk about John Milton. He's best known as the author of Paradise Lost, great epic poem. I'm sure some of you have studied it at university, unless it's been decolonized from your campus. But he was also one of history's fiercest defenders of intellectual freedom. And in 1643, the English Parliament passed a law requiring government approval for any book or pamphlet that was published in the country. It was a system of pre-publication censorship referred to as licensing, the licensing of the press, where you couldn't publish anything, not even a magazine, not even a short pamphlet, without government approval first. It was an extraordinary system of censorship. Milton was outraged. In 1644, he published one of the most powerful defenses of freedom of expression ever written, Areopagitica. I always get scared saying that. It's called Areopagitica. I'm sure some of you have read it. If not, please do. It's on the internet. He argued that censorship insults both truth and human intelligence. He believed really strongly that truth is not a fragile creature that needs to be defended from open debate. It is strong enough to withstand contestation, challenge, discussion. And he wrote one of the most famous lines in the history of liberty, which of course is, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to my conscience above all other liberties." And I'm proud to say that we have a beautiful framed image of that quote in the spiked offices in London where I work. And it keeps us going to remember that there are people who struggle so hard for our liberty to know, our liberty to utter, and our liberty to argue freely according to conscience. Milton introduced a new and revolutionary idea. He argued that truth emerges through conflict. He argued that it's when ideas collide that truth becomes clearer, stronger, and more visible. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with what he said. He said, "Let truth and falsehood grapple. Who ever knew truth to come out worse in a free and open encounter?" He believed that suppressing false ideas does not strengthen truth, it actually weakens truth. Because if truth never faces challenge, if what you believe to be true is never subjected to public contestation, then it becomes lazy. Your ideas go unexamined. They become dogmas rather than true beliefs. And it's really worth thinking about that in relation to the misinformation crusade that you have in this country. Anthony Albanese, I can't even bear to listen to his voice, but whenever I see him, he seems to be going on about misinformation. We have the same thing in the United Kingdom and across Europe. They're obsessed with misinformation, and our governments are spreading one of the falsest ideas of modern times, which is that truth is a fragile beast that needs to be protected from public contestation. That they know the truth and they need to ring-fence it from the supposed misinformation of plebs, ordinary people, or even people in this room. That is the opposite of what's true. As Milton reminded us, truth is strengthened through public contestation, and in fact, truth is only discoverable through public contestation. So when they say that they have to guard what's true from the rabble, they're lying to you. And at the same time, they are undermining truth itself. Milton moved the argument forward. So if John Lilburn said conscience must be free, John Milton said thought must be free too. And if thought is to be tested, debated, and refined, people must be allowed to publish what they think to be true. I quote Milton all the time. especially his really searing insight, which is that censorship infantilizes us. This is the core argument that Milton made in his defense of freedom of speech in the 1640s. He said censorship makes you dumb. Censorship makes you pliant. It makes you into the brainless plaything of an establishment that can just impress any idea it likes into your inner conscience. He argued that he argued that just as we do physical exercise to keep our limbs healthy, so we need to do moral exercise to keep our minds healthy as well. He said, in dis-exercising and blunting our abilities, censorship represents a discouragement of all learning. And he said, our faith and our knowledge thrives by exercise as well as our limbs do. In other words, it's only by taking responsibility for what you think and for how you express it that you're able to grow as a human being, that you're able to become a fully rounded, autonomous person who understands the world around him or the world around her. That's a really important insight, because what that reminds us of is that freedom of speech is more than a slogan. It's more than a policy. It's more than just something us guys in this room support. It is the means through which the individual becomes a fully rounded human being. Without the freedom of conscience or the freedom of thought, we are not actually fully rounded people. We are slaves to we are psychic slaves to the opinions of our betters, to the rules of our betters. We are essentially overgrown children. Freedom of speech is the thing that allows us to become properly autonomous individual human beings. But Milton still lived in a world where freedom of speech, that liberty to utter, was still quite fragile, still quite inconsistent. The idea was very much emerging, but it lacked a political and philosophical foundation. And that foundation would eventually be laid by our third John Locke. I'm sure some of you have read John Locke, an incredibly important Enlightenment thinker. He lived in the later 17th century, in the aftermath of England's Civil War and our political revolution, when we cut off the king's head and did lots of crazy things. 150 years before the French did it, by the way. We got there first. He came after all of that. So he witnessed the dangers of religious persecution. He witnessed the dangers of government overreach, and he witnessed the dangers of political instability. He was a true figurehead of the Enlightenment. He's often, in fact, called the father of liberalism. So if any of you consider yourselves liberal, hopefully small L liberal, not capital L liberal, because that party's down the toilet as far as I can tell. But if any of you consider yourselves genuine liberals, you must read Locke, and you must especially read his letter concerning toleration, which is where the modern idea of tolerance comes from. Tolerance for those who dissent, tolerance for those who disagree, and tolerance for those who believe in a different church to the one we believe in. Locke believed that legitimate government can only rest on consent. Governments must never compel someone to do something against their will or to disobey the dictates of their own conscience. And he argued that civil authorities, the government, the magistrates, the powers that be, they have no business controlling religious belief. He famously said, the care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate. So in other words, your own soul, what you believe to be true, your inner person, your interiority is your business and your business alone. And this was a big shift. Locke was drawing a line between state power and inner belief. He said that belief cannot be forced on people. True conviction cannot be produced by punishment or law. He said that men's minds should never be changed by fire or by sword, and in fact they can't be. He argued for the fundamental right of every individual to be true to himself. And I say himself intentionally because women weren't included in these fine arguments at that time, but that would come later. Locke said men should be free to live by the light of their own reason, and they should be free to obey the dictates of their own conscience, and they should never blindly resign themselves to the will of their governors. just think about how radical that idea was in the late 1600s and the early 1700s. Saying that today is radical. Saying that today would get you, called a bigot on the ABC, or called a spreader of misinformation by the Albanese regime, or, get you blacklisted from a university campus where they make fun of freedom of speech and think that only white men support freedom of speech. And yet John Locke was saying that 300, 400 years ago. It really is extraordinary. That's a message for our time, and one that we should remember. And but Locke did not argue for unlimited speech. He didn't argue for the right of everyone to speak freely in the public realm as they see fit. He still accepted some restrictions, especially regarding political stability and also certain extreme religious ideas. He wasn't particularly fond of people like me, Roman Catholics, expressing ourselves. To be fair, we were quite extreme, dangerous players in England at the time. But he had limitations. He wasn't convinced that, he was absolutely convinced that freedom of conscience was essential to the good life, but he hadn't yet embraced the idea of freedom of speech. John Lilburn defended conscience. Milton defended open debate. John Locke explained why both were essential to human understanding and legitimate government. But there was still one step left. One step further towards that great liberty to utter, which we're all interested in. And that would be from our final John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was writing in the 19th century. He lived in a world that had changed dramatically from what had come previously. Democracy was expanding, printing technology was spreading ideas faster than ever before. Public opinion itself had become a very powerful tool, especially in politics. And John Stuart Mill saw a new danger emerging, not just government censorship, but social censorship. The pressure of the majority to silence unpopular views. What he referred to as the tyranny of custom, the way in which we are pressured in a very subtle fashion, but a very real fashion, to believe certain things and to disbelieve other things. In 1859, John Stuart Mill published On Liberty. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. One of the great works of liberty you will ever read. Every page has got a blinding insight. It's an extraordinary work. And he made a really bold and quite unsettling argument. He said that silencing any opinion is dangerous, even if the opinion is false. This had not really been said before in any meaningful way. Milton got towards that argument by saying we should let truth and falsehood fight in the public realm. But John Stuart Mill made the first stirring defense of the right of people who hold false beliefs to express them in public. He wrote, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person was of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he would be justified in silencing mankind itself." What he meant by that, if there was just one person in the world who believed some crazy, stupid idea, we have no right to censor that person. You have no right to censor anyone who is simply saying what they believe to be true, even if it is patently untrue. Mill offered 3 reasons for why free speech must be protected in all instances. First, because the suppressed opinion might be true. History, he said, is full of examples where minority opinions later become accepted as truth. We all know this from our history. We know that it used to be a minority opinion to say that the earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around. That's now accepted as truth, except by, lunatics like Candy Sones and other flat earth people. And we see the similar thing today. Minority, what is an unfashionable opinion today, certainly in the ruling class, is actually going to be proven to be true in the future. So, for example, Roxanne Tickle is a man. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Roxanne Tickle case. He's the big bloke who is insisting on his right to join a women-only app run by the heroic Sal Grover, and she's trying to prevent him from joining. And if you were to go on air or in a newspaper or on a university campus and say Roxanne Tickle is a man, you would be hounded off campus, you would be shouted down, you might even be censored. But that is true And at some point, it will be proven to be true. And we should always remember the words of George Bernard Shaw. He said, all great truths begin as blasphemies. So what is blasphemy today may well become established truth in the future. Secondly, said John Stuart Mill, even false opinions can be useful because they force true opinions to defend themselves. And he said that the expression of false opinions is good for society because they prevent truth from curdling into a mere dogma, into something we just believe out of habit. And instead they force the truth to fight for its existence against ideas that are untrue. So it's good to hear false ideas. I was on Q&A in Australia maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we were talking about hate speech. And I said, I love to hear hate speech. For 2 reasons. Firstly, it reminds me that I'm in a free country and people can express all sorts of ideas. And secondly, it allows me to challenge it. It puts me on the spot and it makes me assert what I believe to be true in opposition to the hateful ideology. Of course, everyone went nuts. The Sydney Morning Herald published a piece saying, white man loves hate speech, and, the typical response. But I was playing my John Stuart Mill role, which is that even the expression of hateful ideas, or what he called false opinions, is a good thing for society. It compels us all to take our freedom and our beliefs more seriously. And thirdly, he said that most opinions, even the crazy ones, contain at least a partial truth. An open debate allows societies to refine our understanding by combining different perspectives. That sounds like a bit of a hippie-ish idea, happy-clappy idea, but it's true. Everyone expresses some element of truth in what they say, and teasing that out and listening to people is incredibly important. And I think one of the searing insights that John Stuart Mill had is that it's only by subjecting our ideas to public argument, he developed Milton's case here, it's only by doing that we can be sure that what we think is correct. Only by subjecting it to as wide and crazy and frank a discussion as possible can we be sure that we are believing something true. He called it the complete liberty of contradicting your ideas. So when you're defending freedom of speech, you're not just defending your right to speak, which is important. You're defending everyone else's right to call you an idiot, to say you're talking shit, excuse my language, to say you're wrong, to test you. Freedom of speech is a double freedom. It's the freedom of the individual to express him or herself, and it's the freedom of everyone else to use what Milton called their moral muscles and to decide for themselves whether you are right or you are wrong. When governments censor, they are silencing the individual and they are infantilizing everybody else. They are robbing you of the right to say what you believe to be true, and they are robbing everyone else in society of the right to hear what you have to say. It is a double crime against liberty. So that's the long journey of liberty as I understand it. When we place these 4 Johns together, we see a really remarkable progression. John Lilburn stood in chains, being pelted by rotten fruit, and said that conscience must be free. John Milton insisted that ideas must be allowed to compete in open debate. John Locke argued that liberty of thought and belief are essential to human knowledge and legitimate government. And John Stuart Mill concluded that society itself depends on the protection of freedom of speech, even dangerous, unpopular, and uncomfortable speech. And together they transformed liberty from a private spiritual right into a public political principle. And it's really important that we know that history, where this comes from, why it happened, and why it's a good thing. Freedom of speech has never been easy. It is always uncomfortable. It requires tolerance, disagreement, uncertainty, argument, conflict, outrage, sometimes even war. These are all things that have been fought and waged on our behalf by people who are today written off as dead white European males who should be decolonized from the curriculum. But they are the people who gifted us with the societies we currently live in. And my concern, I guess, is that we are unwinding some of those great gains. Because if you look at an idea like hate speech, not only is that an attack on the public political principle of freedom of speech, it's also an attack on your private spiritual rights. It's the policing of an emotion. Think about how crazy it is that the authorities think they have the right to tell you how to feel. Not only what you can say, but also whether you are allowed to feel hatred. Hatred is an emotion. Might not be a big and clever emotion, though sometimes it can be, but it's an emotion. They are reinvading our souls. They are reinvading that private space of conscience that so many generations before ours argued for the liberation of. So we are living through an extraordinary period where not only is speech being undone, freedom of speech, but so is freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. We live under governments that want to tell you how to feel, how to emote, how to express yourself, what tone to use, what ideas to hold, what is allowed to exist in your brain. And that is wrong, and that is a crime against enlightenment. And I think we should follow the 4 Johns and remind ourselves that freedom to think, freedom to believe, and freedom to speak are the foundation stone of humanity itself. And without them, we lose not only our rights to talk, but we lose our very humanity. Thank you.